They didn't know I was the one sitting at the end of that conference table. They walked in with their lawyer, their folders, their confidence, and they still didn't know. I watched my brother straighten his tie. I watched my stepmother set her purse down like she owned the room. And then their attorney looked up from his papers, looked at me and said, "Dr. Okafor, we didn't realize you'd be handling this personally." My brother's face did something I'd waited 22 years to see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start where it actually began. In a kitchen that smelled like burnt coffee and disappointment. On a Tuesday night in March, when I was 17 years old and my father told me I had 2 weeks to find somewhere else to live. I was the daughter my father never quite knew what to do with. My mother died when I was 9. A car accident on I-95. A Tuesday morning. A driver who ran a red light. After that, it was just me and my dad in a house that was suddenly too quiet, with a grief neither of us knew how to talk about. We managed. We were okay, actually, for a few years. He coached my little league team. I made him laugh at dinner. We had a rhythm. Then he met her. My stepmother came into our lives when I was 13. She was polished, organized, and she had a son from her first marriage, 2 years older than me, handsome in that easy, careless way that people who've never had to try tend to be. She made it very clear, without ever saying so directly, that there was a hierarchy in our house now. Her son was at the top of it. I was tolerated. By 15, I had learned to stay out of the way. By 16, I had learned that anything I accomplished, a good grade, a science fair ribbon, a compliment from a teacher, would be quietly diminished at dinner. "That's nice, but your brother got a 4.0 this semester." He wasn't my brother. But I stopped saying that out loud. The real trouble started when I applied for a scholarship, a full ride to a pre-med program at a summer institute, competitive, prestigious, the kind of thing that changes a 17-year-old's whole trajectory. I applied without telling anyone. I didn't want the commentary. I didn't want my stepmother asking whether I was realistic about my chances. I got in. I found out on a Friday afternoon. I sat with that letter in my room for 3 hours, reading it over and over, feeling something warm and terrified all at once. When my dad got home, I told him at dinner. I was so happy I couldn't flatten my voice the way I usually did. It came out bright and electric. My stepmother smiled the smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's a lot of commitment for the summer," she said. "We were going to do the lake house this July." My dad nodded slowly. He looked at her, not at me. That was the night I understood that I had already lost him in the ways that mattered. The next few weeks were cold. My stepmother stopped speaking to me directly. My brother. I'll call him that because there's no better word for what he was. Not a friend, not a stranger, something worse. Started making small comments about my scholarship being a diversity thing, about how medicine was a pretty ambitious reach for someone with my grades. My grades were excellent. He knew that. The comments weren't about my grades. I left for the program in June. It was the best 8 weeks of my life. I worked harder than I ever had. I stayed up until 2 in the morning, not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I met people who talked about ideas, the way I did, with hunger. I came home in August a different person. My dad barely looked up from the television. In September of my senior year, I started the applications. Pre-med track, full scholarships where possible, schools far enough that I could breathe. I told my dad in October. He said he was proud of me. It was a sentence he delivered the way you read from a grocery list. In November, my stepmother found my FAFSA form on the printer. There was a conversation I wasn't part of. Then there was a conversation I wasn't part of. Then there was a conversation I was. My dad sat me down on a Tuesday evening. He told me that he and my stepmother had discussed it, that the house was under financial strain, that my brother, her son, was starting college next year too, and that they couldn't be expected to support 2 college students at once. "But I'm applying for full scholarships," I said. "I've already been shortlisted at 2 schools." "There are other costs," he said. He wasn't looking at me. "What does that mean?" He told me I had 2 weeks to make arrangements. I sat very still. I had learned to do that, to go still on the outside when something was tearing through me on the inside, because showing it only ever made things worse in that house. I nodded. I said okay. I stood up and walked to my room, and I sat on the edge of my bed for a long time. The next morning, I called my aunt. My father's sister, my Aunt Vivienne, was 61 years old, retired, and lived 40 minutes away in a small house with a garden she tended obsessively and a cat named something I could never pronounce correctly. She had been at my mother's funeral. She had sent me birthday cards every year without fail, even when my stepmother started forgetting to pass them along. I'd found 3 of them unopened in a kitchen drawer once when I was 15. I called her at 7 in the morning. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what had happened. I kept my voice even. I got through most of it before it stopped being even. "Come tonight," she said. "Bring whatever fits in one bag. We'll get the rest later." I moved in with Aunt Vivienne on a Friday in November, 2.5 weeks before Thanksgiving. My dad called once to make sure I had gotten settled. My stepmother didn't call. My brother texted me a week later to ask if I'd left my charger in the bathroom. I had. He didn't offer to return it. What happened next is the part people always want to rush past: the hard years, the lean years, the years that don't make for a satisfying montage. But those years are the whole story. You can't understand what came later without them. Aunt Vivienne let me stay in her spare room on one condition: that I kept going. Her exact words were, "I'm not rescuing you from your father's house so you can give up. You're going to finish what you started. You hear me?" I heard her. I graduated high school in June. I had a full scholarship to a university 4 states away. Not the most prestigious program in the country, but a good one, a real one. One that I had earned. Aunt Vivienne drove me there herself. She helped me carry my boxes up 3 flights of stairs. She cried in the parking lot when she thought I wasn't watching. I studied harder than anyone I knew. Not because I was naturally the smartest. I wasn't. But because I understood, in a way that some of my classmates didn't yet, that this was not something I could afford to waste. I graduated with honors. I got into medical school on my second application cycle. The first cycle had been close, a near miss, which is a kind way of saying the door shut in your face with a polite note attached. I applied again. I got in. Medical school was 4 years of being hollowed out and rebuilt. There were nights I questioned whether I had made a terrible mistake. There was a rotation in my second year where I worked 36 hours straight, on maybe 4 hours of broken sleep, and I sat in a hospital stairwell at 4 in the morning thinking about Aunt Vivienne, about what she had said in that parking lot. "You're gonna finish what you started." I finished. I matched into internal medicine. I did my residency in a city I'd never lived in before, which is its own kind of loneliness. You arrive knowing no one. You spend your first year too exhausted to meet people, and somewhere around year 2 you realize this place has become home without you noticing. I made friends. Real ones. The kind that come from shared suffering. I found a rhythm again. During all of this, I spoke to my father perhaps 4 times a year. Holiday calls, mostly. Polite, short, neither of us willing to name the thing between us. He never asked about my work in any detail. I never volunteered. My stepmother was always audible in the background, a television, a comment, a kind of weather I had learned to navigate around. My brother, from what little I gathered, had gone into real estate. Aunt Vivienne and I talked every week, every single week, without exception. She knew my patients, not by name, but by story. She knew which cases stayed with me. She knew when I was burning out, and she said so plainly. She sent me soup mix through the mail, which I made in my tiny apartment kitchen and ate from the pot. She was my home base, the fixed point I oriented myself around. I became an attending physician at 31, 11 years after my father told me I had 2 weeks to make arrangements. I got the call about Aunt Vivienne on a Thursday morning in October. She'd had a fall, hip fracture, then complications, the kind that cascade in older patients, one system affecting another, the body's margins shrinking. She had been in the hospital for 4 days before the nursing staff tracked down my number. She'd been listed as having no emergency contacts, which was Vivienne being Vivienne, because she was stubbornly private and had never liked the idea of burdening anyone. I drove through the night. I got there while she was still lucid, which I will be grateful for as long as I live. We talked for 3 hours. She told me she'd always known I would be okay. She said it the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, with no sentimentality, which made it more true rather than less. She died 6 days later. Peacefully, which is the word we use when we mean the end came without drama, and sometimes that is the only mercy we can offer. She left me everything. I didn't know she had anything to leave. Vivienne had lived simply, spent carefully, and apparently invested consistently for 30 years with the patience of someone who understood that time was the real currency. When the estate attorney called me, I sat down on my kitchen floor and read the number twice. It was more than I had made in my entire career so far. The house, the accounts, a piece of land upstate she had bought quietly in the 90s and never mentioned. She had changed her will the year I started medical school. The attorney told me that. Said she'd come in on a January afternoon and been very clear about what she wanted. I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time. I was still processing it. The grief, the gratitude, the strange weight of being someone's entire legacy. When my father called. Not the usual holiday call. An actual intentional call on a Tuesday in November. He asked how I was holding up. There was something careful in his voice, the way people sound when they're getting to something. He said he'd heard about Vivienne's estate. I said he'd heard about Vivienne's estate. I said yes. He said he and my stepmother had been talking and that as Vivienne's brother he felt there was a question of what was rightfully part of the family. I let the silence sit for a moment. I see, I said. We're not trying to make this difficult, he said. We're not trying to make this difficult, he said. We just think there's a conversation to be had. There was no conversation to be had. I knew that. But I also knew, because I had spent my entire adult life learning to read situations clearly and act carefully, that whatever was coming next would require me to be prepared. I called an estate attorney the next morning. I called the one my hospital's legal department recommended, which meant I called someone who was exceptionally good. I gathered every document. I answered every question. The estate had been structured cleanly. Vivienne had been thorough because of course she had. The will was unambiguous. 6 weeks later, I received formal notice. My father and my stepmother, represented by legal counsel, were contesting the estate. The grounds were thin. A claim of undue influence. An assertion that Vivienne had not been fully competent when she made her final decisions, an implication that I had somehow positioned myself to benefit. The attorney who reviewed the filing with me said it in plain language, "They're hoping you'll settle to make it go away." I had spent my career making hard calls under pressure. I had told families things that broke them. I had stayed steady in rooms where steadiness was the only useful thing I had to offer. I did not settle. The proceedings took 8 months. There were depositions, there were motions. There were phone calls with my attorney at 7 in the morning where I sat at my kitchen table with cold coffee and listened carefully and asked precise questions. There were nights I was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with work. And there was one afternoon, about 4 months in, when I learned that opposing counsel had requested a meeting. A settlement conference, technically. My attorney said it was standard. We would all be in the same room. I had not seen my stepmother in 6 years. I had not seen my brother in nearly as long. I did not know what I expected from myself when that day came. What I did not expect was how small the room would feel. Not in a bad way. Just, I had built them so large in my mind over so many years. The people who had made me feel invisible in my own home. And they walked in, and they were just people. My stepmother looked older and tired in the way that people look when things haven't gone the way they planned. My brother sat down without meeting my eyes. Their attorney was a man I didn't recognize. He came in reviewing his file, looked up to acknowledge the room, and then he looked at me and stopped. Dr. Okafor, he said. There was something in his voice I hadn't expected. Not quite embarrassment, but close. A recalibration. I didn't realize you'd be handling this personally. My brother looked at their attorney. Their attorney looked at his notes. My stepmother looked at her hands. I looked at my own attorney, who was doing an admirable job of not reacting. Then I looked back across the table. I'm handling everything personally, I said. I have been for a long time. We did not settle that day. We went to full hearing. The estate was upheld in its entirety, exactly as Vivienne had written it. The claims of undue influence were dismissed. The proceedings concluded on a Wednesday morning, and I walked out of that building into November air and stood on the sidewalk for a moment, just standing. My attorney said congratulations. I shook her hand. I thanked her properly, because she had been exceptional, and she deserved to know it. I drove to the cemetery on my way home. Vivienne's grave was still new enough that the ground looked different around it. I brought nothing, which felt right. She had never wanted fuss. I stood there in the cold for a while. I thought about that parking lot. I thought about the soup mix. I thought about the phone calls every week without exception. I finished what I started, I said out loud, to no one and to her. About a month later, my father called again. Not about the estate this time, just a call. The conversation was halting and strange, and neither of us said anything of real substance, but somewhere near the end of it, after a long pause, he said, "She was proud of you. Vivienne. She told me that, a long time ago." I should have said something then. I didn't know what to do with that. I still don't, entirely. Some things don't resolve. Some doors, once they've been broken, don't hang quite right again, no matter how carefully you rehang them. But I listened. I said I appreciated him telling me. I meant it. After I hung up, I sat for a while in my apartment, the one I own now, in the city that became home without my noticing, and I thought about what Vivienne had understood that neither my father nor I had managed to learn until very late, that showing up, consistently, without fanfare, is the whole thing. It is the whole thing. She showed up for me every week for 22 years. In the end, that is the only story worth telling. I still make the soup. From the mix she used to send, which I now order myself, in bulk because I know where to find it. I make it in the same kind of pot. I eat it from the pot. And every time I do, I am 17 years old in her spare room, and I am 31 walking out of a courthouse, and I am whatever age I am now. And all of those things are true at once. She gave me more than money. She gave me the evidence that I was worth showing up for. I carry that into every room I walk into, including the ones where people didn't expect to find me there. I've thought a lot about what makes a life turn out the way it does. Not luck? I don't think it's luck, at least not mostly. And not talent either, because I've met people with more natural ability than me who folded under far less pressure than I faced. What I keep coming back to is something simpler and harder than either of those things. The choices you make about who you're going to be when nobody's watching and nothing is going your way. When my dad told me I had 2 weeks to leave, I was 17. I had done nothing wrong. I had, in fact, done everything right, good grades, a real scholarship, a future I had built carefully out of nothing but discipline and want, and none of it mattered to the people in that house, because they had already decided who I was to them. Not a daughter. An inconvenience. I could have let that be the story. Some people do. When the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally make it conditionally, and then withdraw it anyway, something breaks in you that is very hard to repair. I know that. I felt it. The anger of it stayed with me for years, quiet and cold in a way I didn't always recognize as anger. What saved me wasn't forgiveness. I want to be honest about that, because I think the word forgiveness gets used as a kind of shortcut, as if the right feeling automatically produces the right outcome. What saved me was Aunt Vivienne deciding to show up, and me deciding to let her. Those are two separate choices, and both of them mattered. She showed up because she understood something about cause and effect that takes most people decades to learn, that what you give to people comes back, not in some mystical way, not because the universe is keeping score, but because the kind of person who gives consistently is also the kind of person who builds relationships that last. She had shown up for my mother. She showed up for me. That's not karma, that's character, sustained over time. And I showed up for myself because I understood, eventually, that no one else was going to do it first. There is something clarifying about being left with very little. You find out what you actually have. What I had was a mind I was willing to use, and a stubbornness I was willing to call determination. I had Vivienne's spare room, and her one condition: keep going. So I kept going. The irony of that conference room, my father's attorney looking up and recalibrating everything he thought he knew about the situation, is satisfying in the way that real life occasionally, rarely, offers. But I want to be careful about that satisfaction, because the point was never to be proven right in front of the people who doubted me. The point was to build something real. The proof was incidental. What I learned from all of this is that ethics and intelligence and resilience are not separate things. They work together or they don't work at all. You cannot build a life on intelligence alone. I have watched brilliant people make choices that destroyed everything they built because they lacked the moral backbone to do the harder right thing. You cannot sustain resilience without the intelligence to keep learning from what breaks you, and without ethics. Without the basic commitment to treating people the way Vivienne treated me, with consistency and without condition, none of it holds. She left me money. But what she actually left me was the proof of a life lived with integrity. The money was just what happened when you live that way for long enough. I think about that every time I walk into a difficult room. I am there because someone showed me what it looks like to keep showing up. All I have ever done, really, is try to deserve it.